Hey everyone, I'm Michael, and welcome to another socially distant dev update. It's been a while. I have been incredibly busy working on Restitched, and I'll level with you guys. I have been very unmotivated to work on socially distant the past few months, but a few nights or so ago, I actually got, um, I had an idea of how I could massively optimize the Unity version of the game. Now, socially distant is in a bit of a weird state right now, where it can't decide which game engine it wants to be built with. And by that I mean I can't decide what game engine I want to use for the game. So there's currently an Unreal port of the game, and a Unity port of the game. And there was a little bit where I tried to make my own game engine and tried to port the game to that, but that didn't work out. So there's kind of two versions of the game, and I'm trying to pick one and stick with it. And quite frankly, given that I work on Restitched and Restitched is in Unity, I would prefer to be using Unity. There are issues with Unity's UI system, and most of them related to layout issues, but we have some ways around them with Restitched, and it works out really well. And I'd like to use that same sort of framework in Socially Distant. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about Terminal, which is the ultimate reason I switched to Unreal. The Terminal in Unity has always been a pain point. And here's what I mean. So if I open it up, ignore that it flashbangs you when you first open it, that's a bug. And kind of shows the technique that I'm using to optimize it. The terminal has always been a pain point. And the reason is well, it supports multicolor. If I do a Neo fetch, you can see that there's quite a lot going on. First of all, you would have saw, if you looked closely, that there was tab completion, and the completion was kind of faded out compared to the rest of the text I was typing. But then you also see that there's the NeoFetch color bars there, right? And furthermore, if I start highlighting text, you can see that the text gets inverted. And you can see the text that I have selected. This is multicolor. Additionally, it's hard to demo in this part of the game's development, but there's support for bold, italic, underline, and strike-through, and that's all font rendering stuff. So actually what I'm doing here is the terminal is using TextMeshPro, as you should be using in Unity UI. And TextMeshPro has formatting codes you can use. They're kind of like HTML formatting tags that you can use to set the font style and the size and the color and stuff like that. And it also has a feature where you can mark text, and what that means is, well, it's a selection marker. Except not really, because TextMeshPro in its infinite wisdom renders the mark above the text. So you don't get this effect where you can render a solid color mark around a piece of text and actually see the text, because the mark is rendering in front of the text, and if it's solid, that means it's going to obscure the actual text and you won't be able to see it. So the Unity documentation says to render the text, or render the mark with a translucent color, that way you can see the text. So it acts sort of like a highlighter in real life. And I don't want that, because if I were to take these color bars, for example, and make them translucent, well, they would appear kind of desaturated or darker, or just not what I want. And so what I've done originally is I actually had two TextMeshPro objects. One for all the background markings, and one for the actual text. And This worked fine for a while. The problem is, and there's a reason I have the little stats panel open in the corner to monitor the frame rate as I use the terminal. Right now I'm getting around 180, 170 here and there. I'm recording right now, so obviously my GPU is being used a little bit by OBS. But, you know, I'm hovering around the 180s, and this is not far off of how Restitched would run. Which says a lot, because Restitched is a more complicated game. And this is not ideal that it's running at 180 FPS. I'll have to figure out what's showing up the frame rate at that level, but the problem was, with the two text meshes, if I were to start dragging a selection box around, you can see it's nice and smooth now. If you look in the stats panel, the frame rate is fluctuating a lot right now. It is dipping well below the hundreds. But that's okay, because realistically, how often are you going to be doing this? And it still looks smooth. But previously, it didn't look very smooth. The frame rate would drop into like single digits for a little bit, and it would completely lag the game, which is not ideal. I don't want that. I don't want dragging a selection box to chug the game to the point of no return. Like, that's not ideal. But it got worse. What ended up happening is, let's say that instead of dragging a selection box, well, here's another thing that might cause a lot of lag. Scrolling. We do a bunch of neofetches here, then maybe I do a registry CTL. That is not registry CTL. You can see that it's nice and smooth, things come in immediately. And if I scroll, it is also, the frame rate's still fluctuating just like it did with the selection box, but it is still scrolling perfectly, reasonably fast. Previously, that would also chug the frame rate. Which led me to try doing something else. Instead of having two text meshes on the screen, one for background and one for foreground, I would actually have text meshes for each row in the terminal. Now, obviously, a row is, well, one line here. So you can see that the selection box, except for the fact that the dragging is a little bit funky, I have to look into that. The selection box, it takes up one row right now. And that row would have two text meshes. My thought process behind this, now this was a few years ago, no, a little over a year ago that I thought of this. My thought process was, if each row has its own set of text meshes, if only one row changes, that's only one text mesh that has to be rebuilt. Or two text meshes because of the backgrounds. But what I didn't think about was the fact that if all the rows change, and say the terminal is at 43 rows, which it is by default, by the way, suddenly 86 text meshes have to be rebuilt. And I also couldn't do things like, if the entire screen is filled with blue text, I couldn't have one opening color tag to say, hey, make the text blue, and then one closing tag at the end say, hey, stop making the text blue. Couldn't do that. Each row would have to have its own opening and closing color tag, because it didn't know that the next row is also blue. So that led to even more frame rate issues, and my boneheaded brain could not figure that one out. However, after taking a few months off working on the game, I had a little epiphany one night and realized that I could actually solve a lot of the problems by going back to only having 2 text meshes. But obviously I realized that the text meshes were still causing problems. I didn't want to have all of these background elements being rendered as text because that's pointless. They're all just rectangles. Which led me to doing something in the code. First of all, if I hit P here to go ahead and activate the scene view and all that stuff and pause the game, if I descend into the UI and we find the terminal window and then eventually we'll hit the text and all that stuff, you can see that there's only 2 game objects here. There's background and text. And text is your usual TextMeshPro. You can see all the formatting and all that stuff. All the bold, the colors, and all that wonderful stuff. It kind of looks like a mess in the text view here because it's not a monospace font, but, you know, it is what it is. But, basically, what's going on here is the background, I created a custom render component, not render component, a custom graphic for Unity that allows me to plot rectangles anywhere inside it. And basically what this lets me do is, if you look at the preview of it, you might be able to see what's going on here. The color bars are part of this rectangle plotter. So what's actually happening here is, instead of having to parse a whole bunch of markup elements for the color bars and all that stuff, I can just directly render them to a mesh. And if only background colors change, I don't need to draw any text on the screen. I don't need to parse any markdown, and that got me half my performance back. Because now I only have 1 text mesh that needs to be rebuilt. Then I realized, since I only have 1 text mesh that needs to be rebuilt, I can do some optimizations. If the color is the same across the entire terminal, which it would be if I'm just staring at a blank prompt here, then I don't need to render any markdown or markup tags. I don't need to pull any HTML color codes or anything like that to specify the color. I can just say, hey, TextMeshPro, this is the foreground color I want you to use. Use it. So that was another big performance improvement. Then I realized, with the bold, italic, strike through, and underline, since I only have 1 TextMeshPro, I can now only emit tags for those when their values actually change across the entire terminal. So if there's no bold text, there's never going to be bold text. And that was another big improvement. Then I realized I know how big the terminal is going to be. And I can roughly predict how many markup tags there's going to be at any given time. So I'm already using a string builder to construct the markup. If I reallocate the string builder when the terminal resizes to be however many elements I'd want to fit in the string, now I can save on some allocations in .NET as I'm rendering the terminal. So there we go. And with all these optimizations made, I made another optimization. Whenever it wants to look up a color code for the foreground, normally what it would need to do is it would need to find a Unity color based on the color palette, and then it would need to take that Unity color and generate a HTML color string for it, so that's like FF0000 with a hashtag in front. No. I don't want to generate that every time I'm looking up a color. So whenever I set the color palette, I build a lookup table that automatically has all of the HTML color codes for each color in the palette defined. So I look up the color in Unity, and then I look up the color in the lookup table, and then boom, I have my foreground color. Boom. And this also means that I'm no longer allocating strings every time I want to find a lookup or find an HTML color, because they're already allocated in the lookup table, which is another performance improvement. In C#, a lot of your performance issues are going to be down to allocations and string manipulation. So if you can avoid that, then you're going to have a good time. Mostly. The next optimization I made is previously, because I had all this weird, each row has its own text mesh elements and stuff like that type system, the terminal would need to draw each line one by one by one by one. Now, it doesn't. I can just represent the screen as an array of color cells, and then if the background changes, then I have to re-render that background rectangle plotter, that's fine. But if the foreground changes, or the text, or any of the font attribute changes, I only rebuild the text once per frame, after all of the lines have been redrawn by the terminal. So I'm effectively double buffering, which is another massive performance improvement. It's a lot better to do one giant allocation, or not allocation, one giant string builder build of an array of elements than it is to do a lot of tiny ones, because you're gonna end up caching a lot of what you're working with onto the CPU, and it's gonna be a lot faster than having to go to RAM or stuff like that. So, slight performance improvement there. And that also means that there's only going to ever be 2 meshes rebuilt per frame, which is a lot faster too. And then the final optimization I made is, well, leading to this bug when I stopped in the terminal. What's happening here is if there are no color cells to be rendered in the background, the game will just tell Unity to render a default white texture. But it should be translucent and not white. That's the bug. And it shouldn't be rendering anything, but I had to work around some little minor issues with the way graphic rendering works in the Unity UI, and it caused that bug. So I have to fix that. But this is a buttery smooth terminal. There's a lot of technical info as to how I pulled it off. And I'm not even done. I'd like to investigate using these color cell rectangle plotters for the actual text color. That way I don't have to do any HTML parsing or anything like that. That's not really possible right now. I don't have an alpha mask or any sort of blending that I can use, but oh well. So yeah. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the game is kind of not able to decide what game engine it wants to use. And it needs to pick one and stick with it. So, with all these optimizations done, and the fact that the terminal no longer chugs the frame rate to below 10 on my system, at least, okay, there's this little bug. Not really sure what's happening there. Actually, I am sure it's a buffering problem. With all these optimizations in mind, I have actually taken the master repository and force-pushed all of my Unity optimizations over the Unreal version of the game. So, I have decided to go back to Unity. Now this is where I'm going to need some of your help. If you guys really want to see Socially Distant working, and running really well, there is one Unity package that this game desperately needs for some of its other gameplay mechanics. It's one that we also use for Restitch. It is called Optimized Scroll View Adapter. It's a Unity asset, and I'm very familiar with using it from Restitch. It is a lifesaver. It can handle grids, scrollable grids, it can handle scroll views, it handles data binding and all this wonderful stuff. The problem is it costs $70 that I do not have right now to put into the game. So, I'm plugging the Patreon here. I'm gonna start resuming devlogs and stuff like that, and I'm probably also going to make this terminal available for everyone on Patreon to use in their own games. It might not be useful for your gameplay, but it might be useful for something like a dev console. Or some kind of logging or something like that, or maybe you are making a hacking game and you actually do want a terminal emulator that you can hook up to a shell or something like that. I might also make the rectangle plotter code available on Patreon in case you want to use it. So, yeah. Patreon.com/acidiclight. All of the funds from that go towards socially distant development, like, directly toward it. So, yeah. Anyway, thought you guys might find this interesting, that I actually fixed the terminal and made it run significantly better, and development is going to resume. And with that said, as always, I'm Michael. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you learned something, possibly about allocations in C#, and I will see you guys in the next video.